Justin Trudeau has called Canada the first post-national state.
Well, let me put it this way. The idea of post-nationalism it's unachievable as if you're a state. You don't remain just a post-national state. What you become is something else. A state which holds together lots of different nationalities is called an empire. And the problem with an empire is, if it's full of different nationalities, they're going to tend to quarrel and to argue and debate and sometimes to take up arms against each other. So you're going to have a class of people who run the society and negotiate bargains between these different nationalities and police those bargains. And that will mean that the police, the literal police and the civil service, they're not regarded by the citizens of the country as brothers. We are not in power. It's this class of people who don't belong to any of the squabbling tribes who are running things, and we don't think they treat us well. That is what everyone will say. Now, what you have in England and what you have in Canada, and what you don't yet have here to a serious extent, is the phenomenon of people fighting ancestral battles. That's why a unified national identity is an absolute essential for a successful democracy. I may have Polish roots, I may have Indian roots, but I'm an American first, and my loyalty is to this country, or to Britain, or to whatever. And then the people who run the country are your representatives. You could be one of them. They will join you maybe after the next election in being a citizen and not a member of the government. That's very important for long-term harmony. And multiculturalism is designed to persuade us it's not so. And if we continue on a multicultural path, it's a path which is going to go in the directions ever more aggressive and hostile identity politics, and people will feel that their neighbors are their enemies in large parts of the country, and not themselves.
Of course, identity politics is one of the central themes in your new book that I've been reading,
Yes.
you know, with great fascination, Sleepwalking into Wokeness. You know, and this is a very interesting treatment because you've been on the scene. Why don't we actually start with this? You've been on the scene looking at politics. I mean, you started with Margaret Thatcher in the 80s. Just tell me a little bit about your background, you know, and how you ended up in Central Europe. Yeah.
Oh, well, my background is that I grew up in England. My parents were an English mother and an Irish father. In those days, remember, I was born in 42, so my adolescence, youth and adolescence, occurred when Britain was feeling relatively contented with itself because it had won the Second World War, and everybody felt that war was justified and something to be proud of on our side. Although I had an Irish father, and I went to a school, a Catholic school, in which virtually all the boys had names like Murphy and O'Brien, we didn't think of ourselves as Irish. We thought of ourselves as British, with Irish relatives, and many of whom, of course, had come over to Britain to help fight the Germans in the Second World War. So the kind of ill feeling that you now often think of in relation to the English and the Irish, that developed in the late 60s and early 70s. Now, I was always involved in politics. I think I'm the only person, maybe in the Guinness Book of Records sometime, who actually lied about his age in order to join the Young Conservatives. and the Conservative agent, whose job it was to recruit people, advised me not to do this. He said, look, you're young, have a good time, don't get involved in politics. But through my university years, I was involved in politics. University politics. My first job, I worked for the Conservative Party. I was given the responsibility of editing a magazine, small magazine, and I took it seriously and turned it into a real magazine. You know, it had a boutique success. Not many people knew about it, but it was well regarded, and that led me into journalism. And so after a brief time, I went from that job to a job at the Daily Telegraph, While I was at the Telegraph, I was offered the job of working for Irish television and radio, and I really got my journalistic training in both of those places. And I'm grateful to both of them for that, because my bosses were some very brilliant, clever, lively and aggressive journalists, and they never taught me to be aggressive, but they did teach me the rules of the game and the tools of the trade. And then I was for 10 years the Telegraph's parliamentary sketch writer. That's a job which is unique. What it is, it's kind of like a dramatic critic's account of what happened in Parliament yesterday, and you're allowed to be satirical. You're allowed to make it lively and fun, and it's quite a powerful job, because no MP really worries about whether people read a condensed account of his speech in the parliamentary report, but they do worry about whether he's mocked in the sketch. I was a strong supporter of Mrs. Thatcher when she ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party. I was became somebody whom the Telegraph hoped would remain in touch with her. And I did until she won the election, and then I came to America to work at the Heritage Foundation. And when I returned, Mrs. Thatcher asked me to join her team in Downing Street as a special advisor on several topics, but also after hours, the job ended, but a new unpaid job was available, which was that of speechwriter. And of course, that was a great privilege, because the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, used to do a lot of her political thinking when she was writing speeches. By that I mean a minister, when they're doing the civil service job, so to speak, the ministerial job, they develop a ministerial outlook. They don't think politically. They have the department has its own objectives. They become the servants of those objectives. When you actually have to think, how am I going to sell all of this to the British people? What must I change in it in order to make it more acceptable? What should I emphasize? Then you start to think politically. And that's why Mrs. Thatcher did a lot of her political thinking when sitting around the table with the 4 or 5 other people who worked with her on this too. And so I was kind of involved in that kind of thinking about politics.
Just very, very briefly, was she we kind of have a very stereotypical, almost mythical view of Miss Thatcher. Was she like that in reality?
You're thinking of her Boadicea act, right? Okay. She was a mixture of that and of ordinary English housewife. If you were coming around to interview her, she would be very worried about whether or not you were sitting in a draft. Were you comfortable? Would you like a cup of coffee? She would be she would revert at once to being a nice middle-class English woman who was thinking of her guests' comfort. And she never lost that. She never lost that. Where her staff used to say of her, she kicked up and she kissed down. She kissed the people who did the humble jobs. Nothing was too good for them, particularly the detectives whom she knew would take a bullet for her. But the ministers, the top civil servants, well, she felt they got paid a lot of money, they're treated very well. We've got to make sure that they do the job that the British people pay them for. And I think that was something that over time, not only did the civil servants come to respect that, but the British people came to know about it. They came to sense it. Mrs. Thatcher went through periods of unpopularity, but at no point, I think, after the first year or two, at no point did the British public not think that she was on their side. They knew, she was batting for them. And that's a big difference to the situation today.
And in what way?
Because they don't feel that the government is batting for them.
Oh, you mean in the UK specifically, or in general?
And it's true, I think, across Europe. They think that there is a governing class, there is a political class, and that is a kind of oligarchy that is looking out for its own interests. Now, you might say that from the oligarch's point of view, those interests are important political principles and the welfare of people. But that is not how they are seen. And I think that skepticism about them is correct. They have come to feel that large numbers of their constituents are, backward looking.
The term deplorables comes to mind.
Exactly,
right.
all of that kind of thing. No governing class, no political party, no political leader can think of people in that way and expect to do well. They have to respect their constituents, even when they disagree with them. And I would say one of the most, if you are dealing with someone who you realize doesn't agree with you, you're asked a question. I think a good way to begin a reply is to say, I'll give the answer to that, but I'm going to tell you now, you won't like it. Now, when you then give the answer, the person then, in a sense, says, okay, well, that's fair enough. I see, I don't agree, but we can quarrel, we can quibble. And I don't think that kind of basic insight is something that a lot of modern politicians grasp. Mrs. Thatcher did grasp it. When you were sitting down with her, one of the most frequent things she said was, but what will Mrs. Buggins think about this? But Mrs. Buggins being the mythical ordinary voter. And when Mrs. Thatcher said about somebody we were thinking of hiring or somebody she was going to mention in the speech, is he one of us? Is she one of us? She meant, does he or she share our general outlook? Are we, they like us, do we like them? Not are they part of a small coterie, but are they part of a large group of the British public who are concerned about this?
You said something to me, I noted down when we were talking about your book. Violence enters the bloodstream of societies when governments treat criminals as if they're politicians.
In the context of both of Ireland and in particular, sympathy for terrorism, or a belief that the terrorists are the people who in some sense have got the key to solving the problem. I don't mean the key, but if we treat them right, we can get the problem solved. Governments must remember that people are not represented by armed groups. And the majority of people, in almost all cases, I can't say in everyone, do not believe in supporting people who are murdering their neighbours and one day might murder them for some political objective, even one they share.